My name is Mark Hagel. Welcome to the Employment Alliance Group. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm delighted that you could be here today, either in person or virtually. I know a number of people indicated they were not able to join in person. We're going to try to join us virtually, so hopefully that's the case. Others were really interested and they wanted to make sure they got a video of this, and so our colleagues are going ahead and arranging for a video of this presentation as well. So it's really my privilege to introduce my friend, Dr. Alan Gregerman. Alan and I have known each other for a really long time. I don't know exactly how many years. I should know that, but Alan is a.
I think we both had more hair than.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. A nationally internationally known author, consultant, writer, innovator, entrepreneur, and an all-around wonderful human being. So he has written a number of excellent books. Some of you may have heard, some of you that I've talked about in the past, including Surrounded by Geniuses, The Necessity of Strangers, and Lessons from the Sandbox. I am personally excited. He's got a new book coming out this year. It's called The Wisdom of Ignorance, Why Not Knowing Can Be the Key to Innovation in an Uncertain World. It's going to come out later this fall. Alan speaks all over the country. He speaks internationally, and he's kind enough to join us this morning. So without further ado, Alan.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the kind introduction. Appreciate your friendship. Appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate all of you being back there. I won't turn my back again, but hello and greetings. I'm delighted to be here. I know your focus is on employment law, and I'm a little bit different in terms of speaking, but I want to stretch your thinking this morning. And I want to stretch your thinking in particular about how we unlock the genius in people. So that's, if you think about all the books I've written, and I started a consulting firm, I met this 37 years ago, that's focused on innovation. The absolute kind of core of the work I do is helping companies and organizations to compete, remain relevant, and unlock the genius in all of their people. And so as Mark mentioned, I write books about that, and I have a new book coming out, and that new book is called The Wisdom of Ignorance. Probably a little bit of bad timing because we're surrounded by a fair amount of ignorance right now. But I want you to think about a very powerful idea. So let me ask you a question just to get started. And the question is really very simple. Do you think in a quest to remain relevant in the future, it's better to be an expert and know a lot, or better to know very little? It's kind of an intriguing question. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's really at the heart of the work I've been doing lately. So here's my view of it. My view is if we want to be incrementally better, and we want to continue to improve, we often talk in organizations about continuous improvement. It's really good to know a lot. Knowing a lot allows us to know the ins and outs of everything we do, and it allows us really to figure out how to make things better and more valuable. If we want to actually create a breakthrough, we're way better off not knowing much about something. And not knowing much encourages us to take a fresh look at things, because since we don't know a lot, we're unburdened by having a lot of expertise about it. It turns out most of the major breakthroughs that have occurred in the last 5 or 6 or 10 years have occurred because people have decided to just look at something they didn't know a lot about, but knew it could be better. And in knowing it could be better, they dramatically think differently about it. So what I want all of you to think about in the time we have together is the simple notion that in order for us to be truly successful in the future, we need to make sure that we're motivating all of our people to regularly take a fresh look at the things they're responsible for, whether they know a lot or not. And so I want you to start to think about that. I should preface everything I say with a few ideas. And so one is, there absolutely are times, this is a doctor, there are times when knowing a lot is pretty important. 30 years ago, I had major heart surgery. I had my heart removed for 8.5 hours and reconstructed. At the time, there were only 5 doctors in the world who had ever done the surgery I did. Certainly having someone with a lot of expertise in that case was really good. We wouldn't want a pilot to fly a plane that we were on unless they knew what they were doing. We probably wouldn't do electrical work without hiring an electrician. We probably wouldn't do legal work, employment law work, or other legal work without asking an expert to help us solve that problem. So I want you to think about that, but I also want you to think about that most of the things that we need to deal with, in essence, are going to be kind of unknown. So let me get you to think about that. So I actually, even though I'm a business consultant, I'm trained as a geographer. And if any of you like maps, you'll know this is actually the original atlas my parents got me. It's a 1956 Hammond World Atlas. I forget what year they got it for me, but I used to sit on the floor of our playroom and look at all the pictures and maps and imagine what life was like in those. But if you like maps, and I was kind of a geography nerd, and you've ever seen an old map in a museum, you realize that in old maps, in the places that had yet to be discovered, the map makers had a trick. They drew a picture of a dragon. And they drew a picture of a dragon to make it, this is actually a really friendly dragon that I got in Barcelona a couple weeks ago. But they drew maps and drew pictures of dragons because they wanted to suggest that in places that were unknown, maybe it was a little bit scary there. Maybe there were dragons there. Maybe there was a possibility that you either would go off the end of the earth or a fire-breathing creature would attack you. Well, the reality is there are a lot of things that are unknown today, and at the edge of the unknown is really where we're going to create breakthroughs. So I want you to think a little bit about that as we kind of talk today. Also, feel free if you have a question to raise your hand. Scott will see if the people behind me have questions, and then we will kind of answer those. But so I want you to begin by thinking about the fact that we live in a world that's a bit unknown. I'd also love you to think about the reality that our world has changed very quickly already. Sometime when you have a few moments with your colleagues, take a piece of paper or your phone or whatever you use and jot down all of the things that are part of your life today that didn't exist 20 years ago. It will give you a little bit of a barometer of just how quickly change is happening. Then magnify that and say to yourself, the change is happening much faster than it did before. You all have cell phones. They're all your go-to. You all have your information in the cloud. You all book an Uber. You all stay at Airbnbs. You all do all kinds of things that absolutely didn't exist. So the pace of change is all around us, and I'd like you to think about that. Now, I also want you to think about, we used to have a notion in business, and that notion was you had to be around a long time and pay your dues to be particularly valuable and give your opinions. I think that's actually wrong. I mean, certainly people have been around a long time and have institutional kind of knowledge and memory are very valuable to us, but the day a new person arrives is actually should be an epic time for our organization, because as opposed to just giving them a job and assigning them a desk or a hotel space and telling them good luck, we'll talk to you at the next company party, we should say to them, you're new, look around at us. What strikes you that we're doing really well, and what makes you think we could be even better? So I'd love you to get to think about people that way, that every single person that's in our organization has the ability to make a difference. So it's 1941, and a guy named George de Mestral, a chemist, is walking his dog through the woods in Switzerland. This is not his actual dog. It's a dog that was in the movie The Exorcist, for those of you who remember that. So he's walking his dog in the woods, and he notices that his dog is covered with burrs. Anybody ever walked through the woods and had burrs stick to your clothes or to a pet? Well, he wasn't doing anything different than people who have been doing that for 30,000 years, because that's actually how long people have had dogs as pets. But so he notices his dog's covered with burrs, and unlike people for 30,000 years who said burrs were a nuisance and picked them off and moved on, George thought they were amazing. He thought they were so amazing that he took them back to his home and looked at them under a microscope. And when he looked at burrs under a microscope, he got even more excited. So excited that he started sketching ideas of all the ways he could use burrs to improve the quality of life. What George had discovered from a walk in the woods was Velcro, something that is now part of all of our lives. It's in clothes, it holds fasteners together, it's found actually holding car parts together. We Velcro things together. So it's literally found there are like 100,000 uses of Velcro, not based on somebody in a lab thinking brilliantly, but on a guy taking a walk in the woods with his dog. I want all of us to think that we can take a walk in the woods, or all of our people can take a walk and discover brilliant ideas, and that that's something we ought to be doing. I want people to think about the powerful notion that periodically leaving our workplace and wandering around, whether it's Bethesda or someplace else, actually is going to spark our thinking about ideas that could be relevant to our businesses or organizations. So if we're going to do that, we need to do 6 things really, really well. And that's at the heart of this new book, The Wisdom of Ignorance. And so I want to share with you these 6 things because they're really like a formula or a mindset for how we can all prosper in a world that's moving super fast. The first thing I want you to think about is that we all need to have, as organizations, as individuals, a compelling purpose, a reason to wake up every day, a reason to actually show up excited at work that we can make a difference. In the absence of having a purpose that drives us, it's unreasonable to expect any of the people in our organization to be brilliant. I mean, I'd love to think they just come and are brilliant anyway, but we've got to excite them. We've got to excite them for whatever business we're in, that's fundamental. So purpose is truly a kind of compelling thing to think about. And I want you to think about the idea that purpose really matters. So I don't have, because we have all of these people back here. If we didn't, I'd put up a picture, which is the only slide I use because I have props for everything else. But I want to ask you, because we're in Washington, D.C., if any of you have ever been to the National Museum of American Art, which is attached to the Portrait Gallery. And in the folk art section, there's a remarkable piece, and that piece is called The Throne. And so if you recall that, sometime Google it, just put Throne of the Third Heaven and Google that. It's a remarkable piece of artwork. It's basically 184 objects arranged like an altar, all covered in aluminum foil, and all with passages from the Old and New Testament. So the picture gives you a better sense than I can display. But here's what I want you to think about. The throne was the creation, actually the only creation, of a fellow named James Hampton, who worked as a maintenance person at the General Services Administration. Every day after work, he went to a rented garage and continued to work on what he thought was a piece that would celebrate God's return to earth. And so he wrote this piece in the hope that this piece would in some way bring him salvation. It's a remarkable piece. It's amazing. It's his only piece of art. It was discovered when he died and he stopped paying rent for the garage. And the owner of the garage came, opened the garage, and saw this piece. Could have said, let's haul it away, but called the Smithsonian and said, this is kind of interesting. Before I haul it away, I'd like you to take a look at it. And the folks at the Smithsonian thought it was amazing. It has over time been viewed as possibly the greatest single piece of folk art done by somebody who had no professional art training in the history of America. That's kind of a cool thing. That was his purpose, to create this piece. He spent 14 years. He had a compelling sense of purpose. We don't have to have such a compelling sense of purpose around God's return to earth. Though some people are looking to see what color smoke is coming out of the Vatican a few times a day. But we do need to have a purpose, and that's important. Sarah Blakely was selling fax machines. Anybody remember what a fax machine? You're lawyers, you use a lot of fax machines, right? So she was selling fax machines door to door. So imagine that, a fax machine and door-to-door sales. Those are two pretty old ideas, right? And what she was frustrated by was the inability to find undergarments that didn't show lines. And so she created a product, which is now kind of renowned. It's made her a billionaire, called Spanx, okay? Kind of interesting. Her purpose was to figure out how, given her life and career, she could make herself feel comfortable by having the right undergarments to make her look her best. Perfectly reasonable as a purpose. Similarly, do any of you use the app Calendly? So some lawyers might, a lot of people I know might. And so imagine the challenge of having to keep your calendar organized, okay? Well, in fact, a Nigerian immigrant to the United States decided that having a calendar that was organized and making it easy without having to deal with lots of interactions with people, kind of book time to get to talk to them, was pretty valuable. He knew nothing about computer programming, but he hired a small Ukrainian software company to help him develop an app that is today used by 25 million people around the world, mostly in large corporations. That was his purpose, to figure out how to make his life easier. We don't have to have an amazing purpose, but we have to have a purpose. We have to have a reason. We wake up every day excited to make something happen, excited to make people's lives better, excited to welcome God's return, whatever that purpose is. So I want you to think about that. The next thing I want you to think about is the idea of curiosity. Simply thinking about the possibility that things could be different and better by paying attention to stuff. This is a toy version of a San Francisco My Hometown row house. It's kind of a Victorian era plastic house. And what I want you to think about is, until 2009, basically the only way that people traveled was to stay in a hotel. And I know we're like a block away from Marriott corporate headquarters, and they've actually been one of my largest customers, so I love the folks at Marriott. But in 2009, a few friends decided that maybe there was a better way to provide, or a different way to provide hospitality. They didn't do this initially because they thought about creating what has become, in some sense, the world's largest hospitality company, Airbnb. But they did it because they were design students from the Rhode Island School of Design. They knew a big conference was being held in San Francisco. They knew that it was expensive to stay in San Francisco. And so they came up with an idea. Why don't we rent out our couches, couch surfing, to people who are on limited budget? So they did that. They put an ad in a design publication. They said, we have cheap space to rent. It's a couch, but it's an authentic place. You'll get to be with real people. And then they saw who decided to show up. And it turned out it was actually more impressive people than they imagined. That was the start of Airbnb, a company that today has over 8 million listings for places where you can stay. That range from apartments in San Francisco, to tree houses in Sweden, to boats on the canal in Amsterdam, to castles in Scotland, to all kinds of places. It was these guys were curious, once they had had a successful experiment, with whether or not it was possible to actually provide housing to people, and whether other people wanted to rent a couch or an apartment or a house. That curiosity led them to think very different. So I want you to think about the power of being curious. How many of you have ever flown Southwest Airlines? I have here my Maryland Southwest Airlines plane. Only because I think the Maryland flag is the coolest flag in the history of flags. But so, Southwest Airlines, kind of interesting, right? Still today, even with their screw ups, and we'll see what happens, because now they're going to charge fees for bags, which was like a really big differentiator. But Southwest Airlines, until recently, viewed as the best customer service airline in America. So that's kind of an interesting thing. One might think that people who were in the airline business thought of that idea, but it turns out over a drink, here I should have drawn a picture, over a drink at a bar in San Antonio, Herb Kelleher, founder of Southwest Airlines and a partner, drew a map. And the map was a triangle, basically. So think back to your buddy Pythagoras, in geometry class. They drew a triangle between the three cities of Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston, and said, it's hard to get between these places. The drive is long. It's expensive to take an airline flight. why don't we conceive of a low-cost airline that's different than all of the other airlines, where everything is kind of systematized, where we have the same kinds of airplanes, where everything is relatively low level of service, but we do it with a smile and we don't charge people that much. And so Herb Kelleher wasn't an airline executive. He was here. Can you believe it? He was a lawyer. And, but his idea was this can be made better, okay? Didn't know a lot. And in fact, on NPR several years later, when he was asked about starting an airline and whether that was risky, he said, you know, in retrospect, if I'd known more about starting an airline, I never would have started one. But his power was the notion that he didn't know a lot. All he knew was there was a better way, and he was curious to try and figure it out. And Southwest morphed over time to become one of the largest airlines in North America, all based on a napkin from a bar. So I want you to think about the power of curiosity as kind of a driving thing. We need to instill in everyone in our organization a curiosity. We need to get them every day to come in and say, is there a better way to do something? Whether it's, is there a better way to make films? Is there a better way to teach people? Is there a better way to service vehicles? Is there a better way in a world in which people go online a lot and they say to themselves, I don't know, how many Acura dealers are there in the Washington metropolitan area?
6.
So it used to be someone would come in, there's my local Acura dealer, and I'm sure people still do that. But today, people send a message and say, I'd like this car. What's the price to get this car? And they might send it to all 6 of them. I do a fair amount of work with Euro Motor Cars, and so I kind of understand there are 9 Mercedes dealers in the Washington metropolitan area. And so there are an awful lot of customers say, I'm not coming in. I know I want this model of this car. And what's your price? Do you have something that looks like this? What's your price? And then they come into a couple of places to see. So we want you to think about kind of whatever you do, and we want you to inspire each and every one of your people to come in each day and say, I can make things better. Because the reality is the world's going to be different 5 years from now. I mean, the world is very different now than it was January 20th, right? For an awful lot of businesses in the area. So we want to challenge people to really come in each day and imagine where we need to get to, not where we are today. So I'd love you to think about that. You know, similarly,
Right.
yeah, that's fine. It's happened before. How many of you take an Uber? Have you ever taken an Uber? Okay, you probably have. Even people from car dealerships take Ubers on occasion. There's just a time for an Uber. So Uber didn't exist 20 years ago. Today, we talk about, oh, I'm going to get an Uber as though it's like a noun. We talk about, I'm going to Uber somewhere as though it's a verb. So 2 friends in Paris have trouble finding a taxi. Instead of simply saying this is a pain in the butt and looking for a better place to find a taxi, they think about something. And what they think about is the simple idea that maybe technology has changed and it's possible to reinvent the taxi. So here's my kitty taxi. But what if we change the equation and said instead of a taxi, I could, I don't have a lot of regular cars. Here's a NASCAR, okay? One of our customers was Raytheon. They used to support NASCAR, and so here's their NASCAR. But so the folks at Uber said, you know, you don't have to be a taxi to give somebody a ride. And now there's something called GPS, Global Positioning Systems, or GIS, Global Information Systems, that will allow somebody who has a car to kind of find somebody who needs a ride. What if we imagine doing that? Not because they originally started to do it, but the catalyst was that they couldn't find a taxi. That made them think there's a flaw in the way taxis work, and there's a better way to do something. An act of curiosity to imagine. Now, what I want you to think about with respect to kind of companies like Uber, who combine a technology with something that already exists, is what I like to call the 99% rule. And the 99% rule is simply the notion that 99% of all the new ideas are based on somebody else's thinking. That's kind of a cool thing. It's kind of a powerful thing. And it kind of throws our efforts and organizations at innovation on its head. And here's why. Picture the scene in your company or organization when you need to come up with a brilliant idea. You typically get all the smartest people in the organization together. You put them in a really nice room like this. And then somebody turns to them and says, our backs are to the wall. We need to be way better at this. We have competitors eating our lunch, or the economy's changed, or there are tariffs, or there's a new government, or whatever the case is. So we just need to be better than we've been before. Does anybody have an out-of-the-box idea? And then what happens? Total silence. And it's total silence because all the people that came into that room have been coming into rooms like that and coming to your organization or coming into your industry for a lot of years. And they have a lot of ideas. And now we've said, can you actually just suspend the ideas you have and turn on that part of your brain that's actually going to get you to think differently? It just doesn't work that way. But if everybody knew instead that as opposed to taking a blank sheet of paper and coming up with a brilliant idea, all we really needed to do was acknowledge that 99% of all new ideas are based on somebody else's thinking, then suddenly we can be way more compelling, because that suggests that as opposed to having to have a brand new idea, what I need you to do is just wander around looking, bless you, I need you to wander around looking for brilliant ideas and then use those ideas to start our thinking. So how many of you here have an iPhone? Any of you? I picked a good group. With tech groups, they typically have Androids, and so I'm stuck. But no, it's fine. It still works. So iPhone, any of you ever watch content on your iPhone? I'm sure you all do, right? You watch news things. You may even watch a video. You may even listen to Spotify on your phone. So you do all that. That all happened because in 2001, Apple launched this. This was the original iPod, okay? Pretty darn impressive. Okay, you could flip it here, so I could go to the gym with this on, pretty stylish, okay? Or just a fashion statement. And so this held 1,500 songs. You wouldn't want to watch a video on here, okay? And so, but this is where it all started. And we tend to think of Apple as like one of the most innovative companies in the world, right? And so think about this, 2001, okay? But let me get you to think about the 99% rule, okay? Some of you will remember this, okay? It's 1979. And as I walk across the diag at the University of Michigan, I am the coolest person on campus. I know you find that hard to believe. Because unlike anyone else, I have entertainment that's portable. I'm the proud possessor of a Sony Walk person. I have daughters, I'm not going to call it a Walkman. A marvel of modern technology, okay? In 1979, the folks at Sony had figured out how to make entertainment portable. The only challenge they had was that you could only do it in multiples of 12 songs, all by the same artist. Our kids now say to me, when they see my massive collection of albums or CDs, they go, "You bought like the entire album?" I go, "Yeah." They go, "Everybody knows there's only like one or two good songs on any album. Why would you do that?" But so the folks at Sony invented this. So if we go back to the iPhone now, which people think are amazing, the idea didn't originate with Apple. The idea was technology allows us now to do something better. The technology embedded in your iPhone, which is MP3 technology still. I'm waiting for MP4. Andy would know better about this. But the technology wasn't invented by Apple. That was invented by two German engineers in the 1980s. And I would argue the main stickiness of it, the iTunes Store, the world's largest repository of digital content, is a 2,300-year-old idea. Because 2,300 years ago, in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, the Egyptians invented a library called the Great Library of Alexandria. It was a library that had 700,000 handwritten documents. What the Egyptians believed was the sum total of the world's knowledge or content. Today, Amazon, Alibaba, Apple, all kinds of folks are trying to have the most content in the world. They're trying to win, just as the Egyptians were trying to build the biggest empire. But let me even take you a step further, and now we're really going to get to the fact that I'm not the youngest guy on the planet. Because the folks at Sony, they were brilliant, right? They came up with this. But the Sony Walk Person was based on an idea from 1948 called the transistor radio. Anyone ever seen one of these things? So I remember as a young man listening to San Francisco Giants baseball games with my transistor radio under my pillow, falling asleep. And I remember my dad coming in and saying, you know, you really shouldn't have technology on just before you go to sleep. Kind of absurd, right? This is pretty low technology. 1948 Texas Instruments. And so the reality is technology changes, and that's what the 99% rule is all about. It's that ideas that become remarkable are ideas that are based on other ideas. Now let me even take you for folks who are a bit younger, though you may all enjoy. Any of you have a Spotify account? Okay, so Spotify, great Swedish company that allows you to curate your own music. So now you don't have to listen to the bad songs that are on all the CDs that I used to buy. Spotify is curated music. What was the transistor radio? It was a radio that played radio stations. Some were jazz, some were pop, some were country, some were sports, some were news, curated radio stations. Spotify is the modern version of what we used to listen to when we listened to the radio. So I want you to think about the power of curiosity, and I want you to think about curiosity as it relates to this idea of the 99% rule. And that is, if we can be curious about the world around us, if we can imagine or see ideas that are remarkable, we can take those ideas and apply them to whatever we do. They don't have to be amazing ideas. They just simply have to be ideas that are compelling for what we do. So think about it. Think about a business in which customer service, though it increasingly is called the user service or the user experience, is really, really important. I could, in fact, just brainstorm how can we be better at it? Or I could say to myself, who out there in the world has been thinking about this for a long time? And some suspects would come to mind. I do work for Marriott and Ritz-Carlton hotels. I like to think that at least at the Ritz-Carlton end, the service is pretty remarkable. I might hang out with those people. How many of you have ever shopped at Nordstrom? Nordstrom has a different level of service. There's reason to believe Nordstrom will endure. They started in 1904. There's reason to believe they'll endure because going to a Nordstrom store allows you to get personal service. Going to another store where there's not a lot of personal service makes you think, I'll buy it online. But so I could go and see what they do to make their customers adore them and see if any of those ideas apply to my business. So the reality is the 99% rule is super powerful. It really is kind of compelling as we think about how we get all of our people to innovate, how we get the most out of all of our people. The third thing I'd like you to think about is simply the idea of humility. And so the reality is we live in a world where not only is it okay, but it's essential that we all say at times, I don't know, when we don't know the answer. And yet, that's a bad look. Still, in most organizations, that's a bad look. They hire us because we know a lot. But in fact, we ought to actually be folks who are open to realizing we don't know a lot in a fast-changing world, and we ought to be open to making a difference. Think about it. Imagine that this is a bench in a village in a small town, and I'm about to sit here. Imagine that it's a bench called the Friendship Bench, which was a creation, I'm still on camera, which was a creation of a doctor in the country of Zimbabwe, but not just any doctor, one of 13 licensed psychiatrists, 13, in a country of 1,600 or 16 million people. Those are not great odds. It would be really tough if you broke down the math. There's one psychiatrist in Zimbabwe for every 1.3 million people. That would be a fairly significant caseload. And yet Dixon Trabanda had an idea, and it was an idea that was brought about by a sense of sadness and urgency. The young woman that he was seeing was unable to find bus fare to get from her village to Harare, the big city, and took her own life. And he said, we have to do better. But since we don't have a lot of professionals, we have to think differently. And so he decided, what if we put benches in every village in Zimbabwe? And what if we train grandmothers, the most respected people on the planet across cultures, to be the front line of defense in talk therapy and talking people down from depression? So he created benches in every village where everyday grandmothers would sit. They would simply invite young people, primarily who were suffering from depression, to come and sit with them and talk. Being trained in some basic skills about how to have a conversation and how to help people think about managing depression, they were able to dramatically decrease the suicide rate in this country. And it's an idea that's spreading in a bunch of places. The fact that he was willing to say, I don't know how to solve this problem, but I need to think creatively. I'd argue grandmothers are particularly important folks and that they have a lot of purposes, but especially as it relates to talking with young people and helping young people to cope. It seems not so many people are going to do something drastic when a grandmother actually takes the time to care of them, even if it's not their grandmother. The idea of humility is kind of compelling. That's a breakthrough idea. We're only going to create breakthrough ideas if we're open to the possibility that there's a different way, that the ways we do things now, whether it's in business or our lives, simply don't work. Somewhere I have, okay. I have misplaced my Japanese restaurant menu. A documentary filmmaker in Japan goes one day to visit a relative in a nursing home. They have lunch together. He orders tempura and gets served ramen. Now, most of us, if we went to a nice restaurant in Bethesda, would say, no, I'm sending this back. It's not what I ordered. But he said to himself, you know, the ramen is probably pretty good here. It doesn't really ruin my life. I'll just have the ramen. It's okay. I'm okay with that. The wrong order is fine. And then he came up with an idea. He could have made a documentary movie about a topic that was really important to him, and that was a growing number of people in Japanese society who had dementia or memory loss. Or he could create an experiment. What he was noticing was that people with dementia, and it's not just Japan, but in lots of countries, suddenly were kind of shut out from society. We tended to put them in homes. We tended to say, well, sorry, you're just too difficult to deal with. But he had an idea. What if he created a restaurant in which all of the servers had dementia, and all of the servers were people who were happily taking your order but might not get it right? And so he created something, and you can Google it, called Restaurant of Mistaken Orders. It's not a restaurant with a Michelin star chef. It's not a restaurant with an amazing design. It's not even a restaurant that has particularly remarkable food, though the food is really good. But you better like everything on the menu because you have no idea what you're going to get. Every person who comes to take your order has dementia. So you place an order, and more than 50% of the orders come back wrong. And nobody ever turns their food back. Because what they understand is getting the wrong food doesn't inconvenience them, but giving people with dementia a place in society and letting them feel that they're still productive members of society and that they can interact with other people and we're not going to hide them away is a compellingly powerful idea. Think about it. Documentary filmmaker. What was his expertise? Making film. But what was his bigger gift? Being a human. So the idea of thinking differently about something that happened to him was particularly compelling to him. And so that's a powerful thing about the power of humility. The fourth thing I want you to think about is the whole power of respect. And that is, if the 99% rule is important, I have no idea where my next idea is going to come from, but I ought to believe that it can come from anywhere. So I have this really I don't want to say it's a weird habit, it's just something I do, and that is, I don't carry cash. My wife is from Sweden, which is a cashless society. So I've kind of bought into the idea that cashless is a good way to go. And yet, sadly, in our communities, there are lots of homeless people. And they regularly ask, do you have any money? And I don't have cash. But I always say to them, can I buy you a meal? And so I'm at McDonald's one day, and I have to admit, I occasionally go to McDonald's for breakfast because I like an egg and cheese McMuffin and a senior coffee. I'm now qualified for a senior coffee. It's actually not a great deal, okay? But I qualify for a senior coffee, and so you want to take anything you qualify for, right? You just want to get whatever deal you can. And so I'm about to go into McDonald's, and there sitting on the curb is a fellow named Frank. And I said to Frank, Frank asks if I had any money, and I said, no. I said, but I'm glad to buy you breakfast. And Frank says, well, I appreciate that. And I said, what would you like? And he says, I'd like 2 McDonald's apple pies. The Jewish mother in me says, Frank, you need to have some protein here. Can I get you something else? And Frank says, no, I just like 2 apple pies. I said, do you like anything to drink? And Frank says, well, I do like coffee. I said, great, I'll get you a large coffee, black or bigger sugar. And Frank says, no, black is fine. So I go in and I get 2 apple pies, and I get a large black coffee for Frank, and I get him a large orange juice because I believe citrus is really good for you, okay? And I bring that out to Frank, and I give it to Frank, and he's appreciative. And I said, you mind if I just sit down with you and kind of have my breakfast with you, my egg and cheese McMuffin and my large coffee? And Frank says, yeah, I guess so. Why would you want to do that? And I said, because I probably could learn a lot from hanging out with you. You seem like a perfectly nice guy. And I said, I do have a question for you. Are these apple pies really good? To which Frank says, they're absolutely delicious. Haven't you ever had one? And I said, I think maybe as a kid I had one. And he goes, here, have one of mine. I said, no, that's yours. And then I start to talk with Frank. And I see Frank several times over the course of the next couple months. In fact, I probably went to McDonald's more often, hoping that I would run into Frank. And every time I saw him, I brought him, I didn't even ask. I got him 2 apple pies. I need a prop for that, a cup of coffee. Wait a second. This is not a McDonald's cup. And a large orange juice. We sat down and I learned that Frank had worked in the federal government, that Frank was a jazz musician, that Frank loved New Orleans style jazz, something I wasn't so familiar with, but I loved because my dad was a fan of big bands. I loved Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. I learned that Frank had some kids, but he was estranged from them since he was out on the street and had been out on the street for a couple of years. But I learned an awful lot from Frank, and his passion and love of music made me start to look at YouTube videos of the musicians that he mentioned and broadened kind of my view of the world. But probably most importantly, I learned from Frank, as we could learn from almost any homeless person that we talk with, what it means to be really resilient. We think of ourselves and our companies or organizations as being particularly resilient, but it's nothing like having to live out on the street. And then one day I didn't see Frank anymore there, and I haven't seen him since, but I do miss him. And I imagine that all of us tend to think about the logical places where we might get ideas or inspiration, and it rarely includes people who are very different. That we don't seem to think that we can cast a wide net and that we're all enriched because of that. So I'd love you to just think about the notion that anyone that you meet or befriend, you can learn something from, and that's a particularly important thing, but the idea of respect. The 5th thing that I'd like you to think about is the idea of being future focused, okay? And so we all need to do this, and we need all of our people to be future focused. So how many people recall when you were younger reading a book by a guy named Jules Verne? This is my favorite of his books, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Let me just tell you, Jules Verne lived in the 1800s for the most part. He was born in 1824. I think he lived in 1905 or 6. And in that time, he wrote like 200 books, several of which are quite popular. Around the World in 80 Days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The reason I'm a fan of Jules Verne is that Jules Verne was, by just hanging out at the library in Paris and paying attention to the world that constantly walked by him, one of our first known futurists. Jules Verne predicted in the 1800s that there would be submarines. He predicted that there would be helicopters. He came up with an idea for something that resembled a fax machine that you could actually remotely send a document to people. He never made one of those, but he truly had an eye on what the future could be. We might not be science fiction writers, but we need to have an eye on what the future could be. And the best way to do that is to pay attention to what the present is and what new things are going on. So I'm imagining that a number of years ago, people weren't thinking a lot about electric cars. I'm imagining a number of years ago, people weren't thinking about having a documentless office. That suddenly I could have all of my documents somewhere. Wow. Yes. That people weren't thinking about the fact that I could do legal work, and I could send somebody something with DocuSign and ask them to sign it. And that would be, do you guys ever do that? No, you bring it. Mike does it, because he's young and hip, okay. But I didn't imagine doing that. I never imagined that somebody else with their own car would drive me. I never imagined that I would pay for almost everything just by putting my phone against things. I never imagined a lot of things, but I could guess if I paid attention to the world that some of these things were happening. And so as organizations, we need to regularly kind of get out, pay attention, and then share what we think is happening as a way to begin to think about a scenario of where we're likely to be 3 to 5 years from now, so we can think about how to get there. So I think about Jules Verne and the idea of being future focused, and I'd like all of you to be future focused. I'd also like you to think about probably the kind of oddest of the 6 things that I want all of our people to think about is the idea that it's actually good to be paranoid. So when you hear the word paranoid, how many of you think, God, I really want to be paranoid and I want everybody to think about that guy's paranoid? Well, the truth of the matter is that we need to. So if I wanted to quickly think about being paranoid, I would grab my favorite children's book, Where the Wild Things Are. So you all know about this book. So this is a book about Max, okay? And Max was not the best kid. So one night he's banished to his room because he just hasn't behaved well. And because he's not feeling great, he has a nightmare. And in that nightmare, he arrives on an island filled with monsters. But Max, fortunately, by the end of the book, wins over the monsters, and they invite him to be their king. Now, this story has a happy ending, but the key thing that I want you to think about in the story of Where the Wild Things Are is that there are wild things in all of our worlds, and that being paranoid is not only a good thing, it's essential. Because there are people who are out there who are going to eat our lunch, or take our business, or change the way that customers perceive of what they need. And if they're going to do that, we always need to be looking behind us to see who's gaining on it. We need to have a sense of urgency. We need to be agile. And we need to imagine what's possible in a world in which everybody out there, without the constraints of what we know, could literally do anything, armed with technology or not, to change our world. So I'd like you to think about simply the power of doing. Now, all of this is interesting because if I were to say to people in all of our organizations, you know, I'd really like you to be a little bit more ignorant, people would say, first, that's a crazy idea. And then they'd say, Alan, do you have any idea how uncomfortable it is to be ignorant? And I'd say, I know there are an awful lot of times, and there'll be more increasingly times when people will be talking about stuff, I won't know anything about it. If you ever watch stand-up comedy on any of the channels, but in this case, HBO Max, there's a show that just won an Emmy called All of Us by a comedian named Alex Edelman. It's a fantastically funny show. It's very interesting. I encourage you to watch it. But he has one segment in there which was particularly compelling to me as I was starting to think about the wisdom of ignorance, in which he says, imagine a situation in which you're at a party or you meet somebody and they start talking about something you know nothing about and may have no interest in. He said, you know, that happens more often than not. And I realized there were 4 words that I could say that would keep things going well and make people think I was intelligent. And those words are, can you believe it? He said, what if somebody says to you, so what do you think about the Yankees last night? And I'm not a sports fan. I go, can you believe it? Or what do you think about dark matter? Not a physicist, but can you believe it? And he says, as long as I say that, it's really kind of good. I acknowledge to people that it's a topic of interest to me, whether or not it is. I acknowledge to them that it's an important topic. And most importantly, I tell them it's okay for you to keep talking. And then as they keep talking, I continue to say, can you believe it? Kind of an amazing thing. I use it all the time. Our next door neighbor has a PhD in quantum mechanics from Caltech. I have a PhD in geography. Bob believes that because I have a PhD, I must be a relatively intelligent guy. In the things I know, I might be a relatively intelligent guy. We walk around our neighborhood, and Bob tells me about the latest project he's working on, which is a refrigeration system for quantum computers. And I can't tell you how many times in our hour-long walk, I turn to Bob and go, can you believe it? Not because I actually do believe it, because I have no idea what he's talking about, though I respect him immensely. But because I know he takes great joy in believing that people are also enthusiastic about the things that matter to him. So I regularly say to him, 6 skills that are fundamental to our success as individuals and organizations. They're the 6 things I think we all need to do to be relevant in a world changing super fast. I want you to think about the power of purpose. I want you to think about whether you have a clear purpose or whether the organization you're part of is sharing a clear purpose with people that energize. I want you to think about curiosity. Are you challenging people to actually get up and get out and look at the world filled with ideas? I want you to think about humility. Are you regularly saying, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm okay not knowing that? Respect. I want you to think about the power of being respectful to everyone you meet, because we never know where an idea is going to come from. I want you to always think about the future and where it's going, because we're going to have to live there. That's the place we're going to end up, no matter how brilliant we are today. I want you to think about the fact that there's always somebody behind your back, and that's a good thing. It challenges you to do that. I want you to think about all those things, because those really provide a formula for being successful in a world that's moving super fast. We have no idea where the world is going to be 5 years from now, but what we do know is that there will be better underwear and different places to stay and better rides to share. And maybe, just maybe, McDonald's apple pies will be even better, though they could be perfect already. Can you believe it? So I have more I could talk about, but I'll tell one more story. Is that okay? And then I'll leave you guys. You haven't asked any questions yet, but I'll leave you to ask questions. So as Mark knows, if there's one more thing I would add to the mix, I would add the idea of gratitude as a 7th thing, that we all need to show our gratitude to everyone we work with. And I have a unique story about gratitude, and so I'm grateful you're all here for sure. But 4 years ago, I had a really rare stroke, and I actually couldn't see or speak for several months. And I had a team of doctors at Hopkins who kind of guided my care, but didn't exactly know where my care was taking them. My neurologist, and Johns Hopkins is like a famous place, came into my room having looked at the brain scan and the 2 white patches of missing stuff in my brain and said, Mr. Gregerman, I'm so excited to see you. I studied your stroke in med school, but I've never had a patient who's had this kind of stroke. To which, even though I couldn't see or speak, I scribbled on a piece of paper, oh, like, so the word. To her credit, she and her colleagues tried to get smarter about a stroke that none of them had ever seen. To my credit, I hope I sat on the porch listening to books on tape, just imagining, because I'm a future focused guy, that someday I'd be able to speak again. I had 20 months of physical therapy and speech therapy and occupational therapy. I had scribbled a note early on to her that said, speaking is actually fairly important to me. I'm actually a professional speaker. But initially I could not make a sound that could be heard by human beings. I would think I was speaking, but no one could hear me. She put a decibel meter, my speech therapist, on my phone, and I was speaking at 0.5 decibels. A typical human conversation is 60 to 70 decibels. And so it took me 4 months to make a sound that other humans could hear. I know dolphins all around the world were hearing me, but humans could not hear me. Well, fast forward to today, I climb mountains, I ride my bike, I do everything. I don't play much tennis anymore. My reaction time's a little bit slower than it used to be. But what it caused me to realize was that we all live in an uncertain world. We have no idea what tomorrow is going to bring. I had no idea this was going to happen to me. And our organizations all live in an uncertain world. We'd like to keep doing more of the same and hope it gets us to a good place. And yet we get stuck kind of imagining that we're all fine when in fact the world is saying you're not going to be fine for much longer. So uncertainty is part of our personal life and the world we live in. For our organizations, we need to deal with that. We need to be open to the possibility that things can change tomorrow. We need to be prepared. And so that's why I think of these 6 skills as kind of the vital building blocks for creating organizations and for our personal life of navigating and being successful in the world. I figure we don't have a choice, and that to me is exciting. And so I welcome the chance to share more ideas with you. I appreciate that you're here virtually or for you who are physically here. And I hope this has been interesting and connect with me. I'm glad to talk more. Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, that's either a good or bad thing.
Hi.
Any questions from the folks out there?
Nobody in the chat, but if they want to speak up, they can unmute themselves and
Okay.
ask now.
You have a question.
I have a question. First off, awesome presentation, so thank you. In light of your comments, what messages do you have for employers in terms of how they're evaluating employees and how they're hiring employees? How do these factors that you talk about transcend or translate
Okay, good.
into those processes?
Great. So it's a great question. I mean, if you have a few days, we'll get to the detail later. But let me give you the basics of my thinking, and that is, I feel like, and maybe, they're your lawyers, so, listen to what they say. I believe the way we evaluate people is all wrong, okay? I believe that we use performance appraisals that are periodic, and we ask employees, what do they want to accomplish? We tell them what they need to accomplish in our eyes, and then we evaluate against that. What we need to survive in the future world is people who will do what we need them to do, but also make a difference. We need them to see things that we could be better at and to challenge us to be better. We need them to figure out how we can not only raise the bar, but stop doing things that we do that aren't particularly great. So it means we have to motivate them in a different way. We have to motivate them to be purposeful and curious and so on. I believe we need to give people additional assignments, stretch assignments that really get at what matters to them. So I would, when a new employee arrives or at a performance appraisal for an existing employee, I would say, this is your job. We need you to be better at it every single year. But we need you to figure out something that we're doing that you think we can be way better, that may be outside your job. We need you to do something remarkable, bring a group of colleagues together, help us solve a problem and make us better. We need employees that make us better. Now, the challenge is, and you'll have expertise on it, but the challenge for me is the following. And that is, if we hired differently, it would be way easier to kind of make it to the future. And so I'd like you to think about these 6 things as things I ought to be asking about and interviewing about and looking for proof points about related to anyone I might hire. Do they seem to have a compelling purpose? Do they seem to understand what we're trying to do and are excited about that? Are they curious about the world around them? Do they have ideas that they suggest us that could make us better? Are they humble about the fact that they can't know everything, but eager to learn? You know, if I think about it, if I put all these ideas together, they form what I call in this new book, enlightened ignorance. And so that's the wisdom of ignorance. And so just being ignorant and being stupid is not an excuse for anything. It's a bad way to live your life, okay? But being ignorant, which we all are about most things, and committed to figuring out how to solve it, that's a powerful thing. So that's the enlightened part of it. So the enlightened part is I make something happen. I test new ideas. I get out in the marketplace. I figure out how to make this better. So I would interview people very differently to see what kind of matters to them. I think that's fundamentally important. And then I would stay connected with people way more than I often do. And so if I'm a senior person in an organization, I want to just have a lot of kind of touch points with people. I want to find out what they're up to. I want to find out what matters to them. I don't want to wait till the performance appraisal to kind of get to that. I want to make sure that they understand I support and encourage them, that not all the ideas they have are things we're going to back. But what I found in all the work I've done for 37 years is if I have an idea, even if it's not a brilliant idea, I'm way more likely to have a second idea than somebody who's never had an idea. And so I want to encourage the people in my organization that have ideas, even if we don't run with those ideas. And I want to factor that into how I work with it. Is that helpful?
Right.
So I'm very curious, you mentioned that things are changing at a very fast pace, and I think they're changing probably faster than we know. But let's say I work for Mark, and Mark gives me an appraisal of mine, and it's not necessarily a good appraisal. And my answer is, well, Mark just doesn't like me. Our personalities clash. So in the world of AI, I see people are paranoid about AI in certain areas. And that's an area that I think it would hard to argue with artificial intelligence on the personal issue. So I'm curious how you think AI is going to infiltrate this and be a tool or augment items like that.
Okay, good. No, that's a great question. It's a timely question. Again, it'll take a long time, but first I have to say, I can't believe that anyone would love that Mark. He's such a nice guy. But having said that, AI. So, we've all seen even in the last 2 years. So how many of you use AI? Any of you? And so we're all it's becoming like part of our lives. You use it whether you think about it now. When you just do a Google search, you used to do a Google search, there was a lot of AI going on there, but now they shout it out because they want to compete with everybody. So now it's just searching and then So we're all using AI. And I think we're going to use AI in more and more things. A lot of routine things are going to be done by AI. We're going to have fewer interactions with organizations around kind of customer issues. We're going to be frustrated until they figure out how to do it better, because right now it's kind of primitive. But what I want you to think about, and another way to look at kind of these 6 things of the idea of enlightened ignorance, is the simple notion that we're going to have to do the things well that humans do, and that AI should be our partner. AI can help us to do it, but if I can't demonstrate my unique value as a human, I'm in trouble. If what I'm responsible for is something that a machine can do, then I'm in a little bit of trouble. That's why I like humans to say, let me take on this challenge and solve it. Let me reach above and beyond. Let me show you the value of a person being human and creative and empathetic and understanding the world. So I think we have to strike a balance, but that's not a genie we're going to put back in the box, okay? And so I think what we need is humans to say, where does it make sense and where doesn't it make sense? If I'm in a relationship business, AI is not solving that for me. If I'm in an innovation-driven business, AI is not solving that. It may be a good place to start to look for some ideas, but it's not going to be the solution to those ideas. So we have to now magnify, and I believe AI is here, but I believe there's going to be a little bit of a backlash in terms of people's desire to work with and engage with humans. So we need to crank that up. We need to say, what are the things that having a relationship with our people is vital to doing. And so I don't worry about it as much, you know, I'm not totally convinced of the idea that it's gonna make life easier for everybody. There are gonna be dislocations. Some people's jobs aren't gonna be good. But I believe that the more we understand it and figure out how it can supplement us, the more most of us can get stuff done that's meaningful. I mean, that's my main, we can talk more about it. Because increasingly our customers are asking, how do we use AI? What are the things we're doing? And I'm struggling to figure that out. I really like humans. I gotta be honest. I prefer dealing with humans as opposed to dealing with bots. Just my preference. The other questions? Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Right.